On a frozen night in February 1934, the Arctic spoke in a language every sailor fears. A low, ancient groan rose through the steel hull, slow at first, then deep and violent, like the ocean itself was breathing in. Men froze mid-step. Cups rattled. Tools slid across the deck. And then the sound sharpened, metal protesting against a force far stronger than anything built by human hands. Abandon ship. Onto the ice. Now. The order cut through the darkness as the Arctic made its decision. This was not a storm. There was no wind screaming through rigging, no waves breaking against the bow. The sea was silent, locked solid. What was destroying the ship came from below. Entire continents of ice shifting in slow motion, grinding with unstoppable pressure. Steel plates bent like paper. Rivets popped one by one, each snap echoing through the corridors like a gunshot. The SS Chelyuskin had been designed to prove something, that the Arctic could be mastered, that a cargo ship, not a warship, not a pure icebreaker, could cross the top of the world in a single season and open a permanent sea highway across the roof of Eurasia. It was supposed to be a triumph of modern engineering and Soviet ambition. Instead, it was about to become a grave. To understand how it came to this moment, men scrambling onto black ice beneath a polar sky, you have to understand what the Arctic meant to Russia. For centuries, it was not just a region on the map. It was a challenge, a promise, and a threat. As early as the 1600s, Russian explorers had crept along the northern coastline of Siberia, pushing into seas no one could fully map, disproving ancient myths that Asia and North America were joined by land. These voyages hinted at something revolutionary, a northern sea route connecting Europe directly to the Pacific. Shorter, faster, potentially transformative. But the Arctic did not give up its secrets easily. Ships vanished into ice. Crews overwintered against their will. Entire expeditions were erased by cold, darkness, and pressure that no wooden hull, and later, no steel one, could fully resist. For hundreds of years, the Northeast Passage existed mostly as theory, ink on charts, and the broken dreams of explorers. Then came revolution. After 1917, the new Soviet state looked north and saw not a frozen wasteland, but a future artery of power. Siberia was rich, timber, minerals, coal, oil, but nearly impossible to move across by land. Railways were slow, roads non-existent. The Arctic, if conquered, could bind the entire nation together from west to east. This ambition gave birth to the Northern Sea Route. Icebreakers, new, brutal machines with reinforced bows, began carving paths where none had existed. Aircraft joined the effort, scouting ahead from makeshift runways hacked into the ice. Pilots and captains became national heroes. The Arctic was no longer just a frontier. It was a stage. At the center of this effort stood Otto Schmidt. Schmidt was not a sailor by origin. He was a mathematician, a scientist, a geographer, an unlikely Arctic commander. But he possessed something rare. Absolute belief that planning, discipline, and human will could overcome even the most hostile environment on Earth. He had already led expeditions deep into the polar regions, establishing research stations where no one had lived before. He loved the Arctic, not romantically, but intellectually. To him, it was a puzzle meant to be solved. In 1932, Schmidt achieved what many thought impossible. He led the first successful single-season transit of the Northern Sea Route. The voyage was brutal. The ship suffered severe damage. At one point, its propulsion system failed completely, but through improvisation, stubbornness, and sheer luck, they reached the Pacific. For Soviet leadership, this was proof. The route could work, but there was a problem. Icebreakers were not cargo ships. They were too small, too specialized, too inefficient to support real trade. If the Northern Sea Route was to become more than a scientific stunt, it needed something new. A working cargo vessel strong enough to survive the Arctic, but practical enough to carry goods and people. That ship became the Chelyuskin. Fresh from the shipyards, the Chelyuskin was a compromise, stronger than ordinary cargo ships, reinforced and winterized, but not a true icebreaker. Schmidt himself called it a semi-icebreaker, a term that carried both confidence and risk. It could push through thin ice. It could survive extreme cold. But against heavy, compacted Arctic ice, it would always be vulnerable. Still, there was no better option. In the summer of 1933, the Chelyuskin set out to repeat Schmidt's historic crossing, this time carrying cargo, families, scientists, mechanics, and even children. Over 100 souls aboard a single hull. It was a bold decision, bordering on reckless. But optimism ruled the day. The Arctic, after all, had been crossed the year before. From Leningrad, the ship pushed north. Copenhagen, Murmansk, final preparations. Then, on August 10th, it entered the Arctic proper. At first, the sea cooperated. The Barents Sea lay open and calm, warmed by Atlantic currents. Spirits were high. Engines ran smoothly. The Chelyuskin felt unstoppable. But the Arctic never reveals its hand all at once. In the Kara Sea, the ice announced itself. Thick plates slammed against the stern. Steel buckled. Cracks formed along the hull. The damage wasn't catastrophic, but it was a warning. From here on, conditions would only worsen. And yet, life continued aboard the ship. Near Cape Chelyuskin, the northernmost point of the Eurasian continent, something extraordinary happened. A woman aboard gave birth. In the middle of the Arctic Ocean, surrounded by ice and steel, a child entered the world. She was named Karina. The moment became symbolic. Proof, some believed, that humans could not only survive the Arctic, but live in it. By September, the ship pressed deeper east, entering seas that were already almost completely frozen. The Chelyuskin forced its way through thin ice. Repairs carried out as damage accumulated. Every mile forward felt like a victory stolen from winter itself. Then came the Chukchi Sea. Here, the Arctic stopped pretending. Ice thickened. Movement slowed to a crawl. Aircraft scouting ahead reported open water just miles away, but miles that might as well have been continents. On September 21st, the ship shuddered one last time and stopped. The ice had won. The rudder twisted. The hull locked in place. The Chelyuskin was no longer sailing. It was drifting, trapped inside a moving prison of ice. From that moment on, the crew had no control over where they would go, only faith that the currents might eventually set them free. They did not know it yet, but the ship would never move under its own power again. And far beneath the frozen surface, the Arctic was already closing its grip. Once the Chelyuskin stopped moving, time itself seemed to change. Days blurred together, marked not by distance traveled, but by the slow, unpredictable drift of the ice beneath the hull. The ship no longer answered to engines or rudder. It answered only to currents, vast, unseen rivers flowing under a frozen ceiling. Sometimes they carried the ship east, sometimes west, sometimes south, teasing the crew with the illusion of escape. Then, without warning, they pulled it back north again, deeper into danger. At first, there was still hope. The crew told themselves this was temporary. Ice had trapped ships before. When the seasons shifted, pressure would ease. Leads of open water would appear. They would free the hull, repair what was damaged, and continue on toward the Bering Strait. That belief sustained morale through the early weeks. But the Arctic does not respect optimism. As autumn deepened, daylight began to shrink. Temperatures dropped fast enough to be felt day by day. The ice around the ship thickened, compacting into massive plates that locked together like puzzle pieces. Each night, the sound returned, the grinding, crushing groan of ice rearranging itself, pressing against the steel from every direction. Then, one morning in early October, something unexpected emerged from the whiteout. At first, it sounded like wind, then barking, then the unmistakable rhythm of runners sliding across snow. Out of the fog came dog sleds. A group of Chukchi hunters had spotted the immobilized ship and launched a rescue attempt of their own, traveling more than 20 kilometers across unstable ice to reach it. They arrived with little ceremony, faces hardened by generations of Arctic survival, assessing the steel vessel as if it were just another stranded animal. For the crew, it was a moment of both relief and dread. The Chukchi offered help, but it was limited. With only a handful of sleds, they could evacuate a few people at most. The journey to safety would be hundreds of kilometers through worsening winter conditions. Otto Schmidt faced an impossible choice. Who would leave, and who would stay behind to face the Arctic? In the end, necessity decided. One gravely ill man was sent immediately, along with several crew members who had been promised release if the ship became trapped. Everyone else remained. When the sleds disappeared back into the white horizon, the reality settled in. They were alone. From that point forward, survival became routine work. Schmidt ordered preparations for a long winter. Supplies were inventoried. Equipment was moved onto the ice in case the ship was crushed. Tents were erected nearby as a precaution. Every decision was now made with one question in mind. What happens if the Chelyuskin does not survive? The Arctic answered that question sooner than expected. In early October, a sudden shift in wind cracked the ice beneath the ship. For a brief, electrifying moment, water opened around the hull. The repaired rudder bit into slush. The Chelyuskin moved, slowly, painfully, but unmistakably under its own power. Cheers echoed through the corridors. Morale surged. Men spoke openly of escape again. It lasted only hours. The ice closed once more, tighter than before. This time, there was no illusion. From here on, they were passengers. As winter advanced, the sun dipped lower each day until, finally, it vanished entirely. Polar night settled in, a darkness so complete it felt physical. Outside, the world became shades of black and blue. Inside the ship, artificial light marked the only boundary between order and chaos. Then came the next crisis: heat. The Chelyuskin had not been designed to overwinter. Coal reserves were finite, calculated for a crossing, not months of survival. Every hour the boilers burned fuel was an hour stolen from the future. If coal ran out, the ship would freeze from the inside out. Metal would contract. Pipes would burst. Condensation would turn cabins into ice boxes. The engineers went to work. Heating schedules were cut, then cut again. Engines were run only when absolutely necessary. Improvised fuel mixtures were created from oil waste, animal fats, anything that would burn. It was crude, dangerous, and barely sufficient, but it worked. The ship stayed alive, just warm enough to prevent catastrophe. Water became another enemy. By late November, fresh water was gone. From then on, drinking water came from melted ice, hauled aboard in blocks by men working in darkness and sub-zero winds. It was exhausting labor, repeated day after day, with no end in sight. And yet, something remarkable happened. The crew adapted. They built routines. Ski tracks were carved into the ice. Flags marked race courses around the ship. Hunting parties ventured out, competing to see who could bring back the most food. Evenings were filled with lectures, music, arguments, laughter. Schmidt spoke about science, exploration, the future of the Arctic. Others sang. Some played instruments brought aboard almost as an afterthought. The Arctic had not broken them, but it was watching, waiting. By January, the ice beneath the ship had grown monstrously thick. Pressure ridges rose like frozen waves around the hull. The Chelyuskin groaned constantly now, the sound woven into daily life. Engineers monitored stress points, measuring deformation, hoping, always hoping, that steel could still hold. Then, in February, subtle signs appeared. Cracks opened in the ice nearby. Not the clean, hopeful cracks of thawing, but jagged fractures caused by shifting mass. The engineers knew what this meant. The ice was no longer merely surrounding the ship. It was rearranging itself, building pressure, searching for release. On February 12th, inspection teams went out into a raging blizzard to check the hull. Visibility was almost zero. Ice needles cut exposed skin. They found no immediate damage, but they found something worse. The ice itself was moving. The next afternoon, it began. The first shock was mild, almost deceptive. Then another, then a third, stronger than the rest. The ship shuddered violently as ice pressed in from both sides. Steel plates flexed. Beams screamed. Men were thrown against bulkheads as the Arctic finally applied its full weight. The Chelyuskin was being crushed. For nearly 2 hours, the crew fought time itself. Supplies were dragged onto the ice. Tents were reinforced. Emergency stores, prepared months earlier for exactly this nightmare, were deployed. The ship tilted. Decks warped. Water burst through compartments as internal walls collapsed one after another. When the final order came, there was no panic. Everyone onto the ice. Men and women ran. Some slid down planks laid against the hull. Others jumped blindly into darkness, trusting the ice beneath their feet. Above them, the ship broke apart in slow, violent motion, upper decks tearing free, cargo shifting, steel screaming as it failed. One man did not make it. As the Chelyuskin finally rolled and slipped beneath the frozen sea, dragging debris with it, A crew member was struck and lost beneath the ice. He was the only life the Arctic claimed from the ship, but the cost was burned into every survivor's memory. When it was over, there was nothing left but silence. No ship, no shelter, no certainty. Just over 100 people standing on a drifting slab of ice, 80 miles from land, in the middle of the polar night. And winter was far from over. The morning after the Chelyuskin vanished beneath the ice, the survivors woke to a world that no longer included a ship. Where steel corridors and engine noise had once defined their lives, there was now only wind, snow, and the faint creak of the ice beneath their boots. The Arctic had erased the Chelyuskin in a single night, leaving behind scattered debris, tents, and over 100 people who now existed entirely at the mercy of temperature, weather, and time. Otto Schmidt understood something immediately. Shock was as dangerous as cold. He ordered the camp organized before fear could take hold. The radio tent went up first, then living tents, then food, then rest. Structure, even improvised, gave the mind something to hold on to. That discipline would save lives. By daylight, what passed for it in the polar twilight, the situation became clear. Fuel barrels, crates, and planks had floated up from the wreck and frozen into the surrounding ice. For days, teams worked non-stop recovering anything usable before it drifted away or sank. Every nail, every board, every scrap of fabric mattered now. They named the place Camp Schmidt. The radio crackled back to life, and with it, a fragile lifeline to the outside world. When Moscow received the message confirming the ship's loss but the crew's survival, the response was immediate and unprecedented. There would be a rescue, not by sea. Ice made that impossible, but by air. It was a plan filled with risk. The survivors were stranded more than 130 kilometers from the nearest point of land, on ice that was constantly shifting, cracking, and reforming. Any aircraft attempting to land would need a runway carved from frozen chaos. Worse, as spring approached, the ice would weaken, wait too long, and planes would fall through on landing, move too fast, and pilots would face storms capable of tearing aircraft from the sky. There was no safe window, only a narrow one. Work began at once. Men leveled ice by hand, filling cracks with snow and water, stamping it flat until it froze again. 13 times, the runway broke apart beneath them. 13 times, they repaired or rebuilt it somewhere new. Each collapse was a reminder that the ground they stood on was temporary. Meanwhile, Schmidt made hard decisions. Aircraft capacity was limited. Not everyone could be flown out. Priority went to women, children, and the sick. Some of the women protested, furious at being labeled vulnerable after months of the same labor and danger as everyone else. Schmidt listened, and then refused to change the order. He knew emotion could not be allowed to override probability. Survival depended on minimizing risk. While Camp Schmidt fought the ice, another battle was unfolding thousands of kilometers away. Pilots were being assembled from across the Soviet Union and beyond. Some volunteered without hesitation. Others were selected because of one rare quality: experience in the Arctic sky. Among them was Sigismund Levinevsky, a respected pilot known for flying where navigation instruments were little more than suggestions. The rescue effort became international in an unexpected way. This was before the Cold War had frozen diplomacy as solid as Arctic ice. The United States provided aircraft and logistical support from Alaska. Soviet pilots staged operations from American airfields. Politics dissolved in the face of something simpler: men stranded at the edge of the world. The first attempts nearly ended in disaster. Weather forecasts were unreliable. Snowstorms formed without warning. Planes flew blind through clouds thick enough to swallow mountains. On one flight, ice coated the aircraft so heavily that controls began to freeze midair. Instruments failed. Engines sputtered. One plane went down. Levinevsky survived only through luck, experience, and the knowledge of local indigenous guides who helped him reach safety by dog sled after the crash. Even then, the margin between survival and death was razor thin, but they kept flying. On April 7th, the weather finally opened a narrow corridor of calm. Aircraft took off one by one, pushing their engines to the limit. Over the ice, pilots searched for a line of flags barely visible against endless white. Landing was an act of faith, trusting that the runway built by exhausted men would hold just long enough. It did. One by one, planes touched down at Camp Schmidt. Each landing was greeted not with cheers, but with quiet urgency. Engines stayed running. Passengers boarded fast. Cargo was unloaded just as quickly: food, equipment, dog sleds for those who would leave by land. Then the aircraft lifted off again, vanishing back into the sky before conditions could change. Flight after flight followed. 55 people were airlifted to safety in April alone. The rest made the journey by dog sled, guided by Chukchi drivers across terrain they had known for generations. From there, survivors were moved to Alaska, then onward through North America and Europe, finally returning home after a journey longer and stranger than any planned expedition. In the end, only one life was lost. Considering the scale of the disaster, it bordered on miraculous. The pilots were honored as heroes of the Soviet Union. Schmidt became a national symbol of leadership under pressure. The expedition itself, despite the ship's destruction, was officially declared a success. The Chelyuskin had reached the Bering Strait. The Northern Sea route, though dangerous, was real. Stronger ships were built. Better icebreakers followed. The Arctic was charted more thoroughly than ever before. Yet the lesson endured. Even today, with satellite navigation, nuclear icebreakers, and modern forecasting, the Northern Sea route remains unpredictable. Ice still closes without warning. Storms still ground aircraft. Infrastructure remains thin across vast distances. The Arctic has not been conquered. It has merely been negotiated with. At the bottom of the Chukchi Sea, fragments of the Chelyuskin rest in silence, discovered decades later beneath 50 meters of water. Steel twisted by a force older than history itself. The ship failed, but the people did not. They endured darkness without panic, hunger without collapse, isolation without surrender. When the Arctic demanded everything, they gave it discipline, ingenuity, and refusal to break. And that is why this story is remembered, not as a disaster, but as a testament. Because the most dangerous ocean on Earth did not decide their fate. They did.